Much for joining me here today at Re-Written Vintage Homestead. Marshall and I are feeling kind of puny today. Looks like it's going to rain out. So we thought we would read chapter 9 of the book that we've been reading for a while called The Dollmaker by Harriet Arnow. She looked at Jip outlined in the stove light as he stood by the open kitchen door. He whined into the darkness, then twisted his head to look at the shotgun high on its two nails above the eating table. He looked hopefully at her, and then he turned away, whining again toward the sounds that came from the ridge field. "Go on," she whispered with no pause in her churning. "'Fore you wake the young'uns, but I can't go with you. I've got a big day's work ahead of me. Long as there's light to see, I'm going to be down at the farm splitting shakes to fix that barn roof so we can move our fodder and corn. It ain't no coon nohow," she went on. "Them hounds and hunting. They're a chasing a fox, I guess, but no matter what it is, there'll be nobody come to their crying." So all of the dogs are barking and carrying on. There's probably a coon outside. There's no men to take them hunting. And so, they keep getting uneasy and wandering around, and all the men are off to war. She held the dasher still and listened. "Well, that's old Sugar Bell. He don't know that Barney can't hear him or leave, neither in that prison camp in Italy. And that's Lister Tucker's old thunder. He took up with Pop when Lister moved to the Hamptons roads. Come on," she said to the still hesitant Jip, "but there'll be nobody come to you." She turned again, but between the steady glugs of the dasher, she heard the crying of the hounds. It seemed like she heard it all night, the crying, and sometimes like a fiddle hidden in the hills, now far on the ridges, now near across the rented cornfield, rising and fading like the wind, mingling with the wind until it was hard to tell which was a hound cry and which was the wind. She had lain there in her bed and heard it and felt it in the hearing. There was nobody else in the whole country to hear the hounds. The ears for the hounds heard other things, if they heard at all. Maybe some heard in their sleep, dreaming, as she had dreamed of Henley. She stared into the stove gate, trying to remember. It seemed a long time since she had dreamed of Henley, and hardly a month since the word had come that he was dead. Not 5 since he went away. Now there was little left of him but the loneliness in her insides and the land his blood had helped to buy. She slowly shook her head. It was as if the war and Henley's death had been a plan to help her and her children free so that she might live and be beholden to no one, not even Clovis. Never again would she have to wait to break bread till Clovis brought home a sack of meal. "I've reached the land of corn and wine, and all its riches freely mine. Here shines undimmed one blissful day, where all my nights have passed away." The lonesome sound of the crying hounds filtered through the kitchen, but she sang on softly so as not to awaken the children, thinking and planning and selecting what to do first. Today she'd burn the lantern and do the barn work before daylight. Soon as it was light enough to see, she'd go dig up 2 or 3 little white pines. There were no white pines on the Tipton place, and of all the trees that she knew, the white pine had, she thought, the prettiest voice, warm and kind somehow even in the winter. Old John wouldn't mind if she grubbed up 2 or 3 out of the edge of the cornfield, where the next renter might grub them out anyhow. She set them below the gate close to the 2 poplar trees that she'd already set. A poplar was a lonesome kind of thing, not like a maple or a hickory. Seemed like one would hardly grow it at all without other trees for company. Later in the gray, cloudy dawn, she scolded herself for wasting time. She'd better be at the shake making or digging up something useful like a plum bush. But it was such a good time for digging trees. She dug up 3 good-sized white pines and 2 little dogwoods before she hardly knew it. And she wrapped their roots in the balls of the moss that Enoch and Cassie had gathered from a rocky ledge below the field. She smiled as she told Cassie, They'll be big afore you hardly know it, she added with a warning look. You mustn't be a-hurting 'em now and a-trying to climb 'em soon because they're not big enough and they'll break. Cassie laughed her quick little bubbling laugh and then came very close and whispered to Gertie, don't say it too loud. Do you know what that young'un Callie Lou has done? She done pull up your trees. Our little trees, Gertie corrected. She made a mighty frown that brought her brows together with their blackness that met above her eyes. When I get these trees set with the roots spread out, Callie Lou or nobody else, not even a witch can pull 'em up. But, and it was her turn to whisper after a quick glance around, bending low to Cassie's ear, so that the forever listening, watching, waiting Callie Lou might not hear. But if you see her trying to pull 'em up, would you let her know that I'll give that young'un a good switching? Cassie blinked and considered, and then rising on tiptoe whispered, her voice troubled, you won't make it too hard, will you, Mom? She ain't a bad young'un at heart. She's just a little jumpy meanness. Gertie nodded. Well, mostly I'll just scare her. I'll break me a little twig from our porch tree behind the kitchen. No hickory limb. Mom! Mom! She looked up listening, then dropped the tree and started running across the field. Something uncommon bad, like the house on fire or Amos Hurt, had happened. She'd never heard Reuben scream so loud, worse than when he had seen the bear. She was past the barn and running down the muddy lane before she saw her father's white saddle mule, standing carefully still, as she always did for her father, with a plumpish figure, so coated and bundled and scarfed that she couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, that climbed slowly from the saddle and became for an instant hidden on the other side of the mule. Then quickly the voice came, crying out with a sense of anger, pain, and sorrow in the cry, the old cry of, Gertie! Gertie! A moment later, she saw her mother weeping with her face against the porch post. The younger children had rushed out, but overcome by the sight of their invalid grandma getting off a mule, they stood in silent little huddle by the door. Only Enoch could find his tongue enough to ask, Grandma, is Grandpa dead? Her mother broke off her weeping and patted him on the shoulder as she said with such pitying sorrow that even brash Enoch was troubled. No, no, honey, your grandpa ain't dead. Poor old crippled, sad-hearted soul, but he ain't dead. He's lived to see his own flesh and blood bring disgrace to his brown gray beard. Gertie's heart went out to her sister Meg, gone so long. What had she done? Did she lie? Did she fornicate? Did she dance? Did she play cards? Mom, she began. I don't know what Maggie's done, but it can't be much. Meg, her mom shrilled, lifting up her head, anger in her eyes. Meg's a decent woman. She ain't a sneaking and a slipping around and conveying to leave her man and make her children fatherless. Her tear-brimming eyes had traveled slowly from the child to child, resting an instant on each as she designated its condition. But now and again her forehead pressed against the porch post as she went on, her words spaced by sobs. I give you your mammy. Money, your dead uncle's money, her own born brother's money for her to buy you decent clothes and all the things that you need. Your ever-loving papa goes away and is a stranger in a strange place just for you to keep bread and meet your food in your mouths. And there he is, she went on, looking down at Reuben as if he were guilty. Away off in that cold, dirty, flat, ugly factory town, having to mix up with all kinds of foreigners and such, and having to pay money to a union, him that's never been made to belong to nothing. He ain't got nobody to cook for him a decent bite of victuals. He could be taken to the army, and you'd never see him again. And what did your mom do? I'm not scaring you, am I? I think he's good. Reuben's shoulders stiffened. She bought us a place of our own. Her mother turned away, weeping now into the saddle blanket, talking both to the gray mule and to God. Oh Lord, she's turned her own children against their father. She's never taught them in the Bible where it says, leave all else and cleave to thy husband. She's never read to them the words writ by Paul, wives, be in subjection unto your husbands and unto the Lord. She managed to lift her head and look at Gertie, standing stiff and dumb as ever under her mother's words. I couldn't believe it last night when Ridley came over to spend the night and told me that the taxes and the tails had been paid and what was going around. Sue Annie told her that Mary Ballou had said that you was a-buying the old hillside and that old house. It's a good house, Reuben said. Young man, you need a father's hand. You're getting sassy. Do you want the whole country to be talking about your mommy? They don't talk about Ann Liz Kramer, and she's lived without her man for 2 or 3 years, Reuben said, and he looked to his mother for some help. But Gertie stood and looked like Cassie when somebody caught her in a piece of meanness. Uh-oh. I guess Grandma was talking too loud. Ann Liz Kramer lives where her man left her and a-keeping his house and his young'uns and a-doing what Claudia wants her to do, for he's a born farmer at heart. Soon's the war's over, he's a-coming home. Your pop, she went on, looking at Reuben and speaking slowly, ain't no farmer. Your mom knowed that when she married him. She held him back all these years. He could have been making big money down at Oak Ridge, but she wouldn't give in and go with him. No. She stopped listening to a gay and lively whistle and changed soon into Clyde's singing as she climbed the short-cut path home from spending the night at Mamie's. She waited, Gertie watching her, thoughts there was something like satisfaction in her face as Clyde, still singing, not knowing she was being watched, came in sight, and then began to dance like skipping on the big flat sand rock at the top of the path. Gertie wanted to cry out to Clyde that her grandmother was watching, but could not even when she changed again from singing to whistling, and then, no more thinking that anyone watched than a squirrel, flung her arms out wide and did a lively tapping dance that made the ragged coat she wore look even more ragged, while Reuben's old overalls unrolled themselves and flopped around his feet. The only thing about her that seemed new and clean and shining was a Montgomery Ward catalog under one arm. Gertie's mother nodded slowly, her eyes on Clyde. There was satisfaction in her voice and sorrow, deep sorrow, when she said, all the anger gone now, look at her, growing up like a heathen, learning how to dance from that trashy Mamie, dirty, ragged, and I bet she ain't combed and braided her hair in a week. You know she wouldn't have been a-going on like that if Clovis was home. You sound like she was coming up with a bastard, Gertie said. We've all been very busy. Her mother began crying again, sobbing about Gertie's vile talk. Clyde heard and came on, the dance steps gone from her legs now, her eyes fixed worriedly on her grandmother, shame in her face as she had done great wrong. The bright catalog was clutched like a shield against her bosom. But when she had walked up to the white mare, her grandmother lifted her head and managed a wan and kindly smile. What are you fixing to order, girl? Curtains, Clyde said. White curtains with blue bands for our new front room. And her grandmother took her by the arm. Child, you don't need curtains. Not now. Not till you get to Detroit. Detroit, Clyde asked, doubt in her voice. Yes, Detroit. You know, honey, your papa, he wants you with him. He can't make a living no longer by hauling coal. He's a-hunting for you a place, and you know that, a place, and it's close to a school. But Mom said we couldn't go far away, and that soon the war will be over. Enoch was interrupting with cries of, goody, goody, we can go to school again, a fine big school. His grandmother nodded and smiling, but Clyde continued for an instant, troubled, glancing toward her mother, who stood motionless by the porch steps. Amos, not yet dressed, stood in the doorway, laughing and repeating, "Detroit, Detroit," as yesterday he had repeated Santa Claus when Clyde told him of Christmas. His grandmother, quite recovered now, patted him on the head and shooed him back into the house, crying, "Poor little fella. He needs somebody that'll take care of him. A Reuben around barefooted this way, he'll be a-getting that croup again." "He never got it until you come," Reuben said. His voice was hoarse now, broken by growing doubt. He looked from his mother to his grandmother and then back to his mother. The trouble grew in his eyes, but still he watched Gertie, hopeful, unwilling to believe she would not speak up for their farm. She continued silent, and gradually the hope in his eyes died. His glance, fixed on his mother's face, was filled with contempt of the strong for the weak. It seemed a long while that they looked at each other, mother and son. Gertie opened her mouth and closed it. One hand twisted, pulled the joints of the other, and she started up the porch steps, but stopped when through the open door she heard her mother. Oh, she was cheerful now. To Clyde about the color of the coat she must order with some of Henley's money, the kind of little suit for Enoch. Next she was holding forth on the wonders of Detroit. They would have a nice home with the electric and running water, both hot and cold water maybe. And the school, such a fine big school it would be, with a basketball court and a real gymnasium like Meg's children had. Here her voice lifted for Reuben's benefit. He, for all his clumsiness, was good at pitching goals in the outdoor court at Deer Lick School. There would be a fancy cooking place for Clyde, hot lunches for all of them, and most likely a bus. But better than anything, she reminded them, their father would make a good living and they wouldn't have to be working themselves to death in some old cornfield. "But 'twould have been all our own field," Reuben cried toward the doorway. But his voice was too low and hoarse to carry past his grandma's chatter. He stood a moment longer on the middle step, looking dazedly about him. He saw the gray mule, with no more words and never a look for Gertie, led the gray mule barnward. His head was bent, and Gertie thought as he walked away he was crying. She took one step for him, but turned back and went to the chopping block. She had already filled the wood box with wood cut by lantern light, so as to have all of today's light for the Tipton place, but still she chopped lengths from a hard, dead hornbeam she had snaked up from the dock a few days before. Cassie alone stayed with her, silent and with a lonesome look that came sometimes when Callie Lou ran away. Jip stood by her, and she scratched him under one ear and asked, after a long silence, "Mom, can Jip go to Detroit too?" There was such trouble in the child's voice that Gertie dropped the axe and picked her up. "We ain't gone yet, honey. Maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe somehow." Her tongue was still in the face of Cassie's disbelieving eyes, but her mind raced on. Maybe somewhere there was something or somebody to keep her from having to go away. John or her father? No, her father would never speak up. He wanted her close by, so that in speaking for her, he would be speaking for himself. He would cry out no more than Job's dead children. John had her money. Maybe he'd gone already and recorded the deed. John wouldn't break out of a deal. He wouldn't go back on his word. "But Mom, can Jip go too?" Cassie was pulling on her chin, turning her face about so that she might bolster up her mother's limp words with her mother's eyes. "And can't we take the woman in the woods, Miss Callie Lou?" Oh, yes, Gertie said, hugging the child, but not looking into her waiting eyes. "In Detroit," she went on, "there'll be people, all kinds of people. Thousands and thousands of faces we ain't never seen, and the finest we'll pick for Callie Lou. But she's got a face already. She just ain't." Cassie, like her mother, heard the mule's feet in the lane, a click on the rocks, a suck in the mud. Gertie never looked around. She knew it was John. She let the child slide from her arms. John would never come so early in the morning when his legs were bad, to tell her that he had already recorded the deed. She stood there staring out across the ridgetop and saw the sun had risen. It poured red light upon the northwestern side of the ridge. The beeches lower down and the sugar maples were shadowed still, but higher up towards the cove top. The trunks of the tall young poplars were pink in the rising light. It came to her that maybe she had always known those other trees would never be her own, no more than the fireplace with the great slab of stone, just as she had always known that Christ would never come out of the cherry wood. Seemed like all week he'd cried for her knife in the firelight, and now he was gone. Instead, here was John, old and troubled and tired, leaning from his mule. Isn't that heartbreaking? So Reuben and Gertie have lost all hope of owning their own place. And they're so much alike, that's all they ever wanted. It's very sad. We both have to do our duty, Gertie. Your mom sent for me yesterday. From the way she talks a body, you think I was making a mint of money out here selling that land to you. I thought she was going to faint dead away. I can't let a piece of land come between a woman and her man and her people. I'd never thought on it, he went on, when she remained motionless, silent, staring into the valley. But Clovis wouldn't like it down in the holler anyway, from the highway. Mostly, I reckon, I thought on how nice it'd be for you and your pop. He reached for his leather money bag. A body's got to give you the true reason. Recollect when we made our trade, you thought Clovis, he would be in the army. He nodded toward the house from which her mother's chatter came, and then looked down into a leather bag and sighed as he began to pull out the crumpled bills. The right's on her side. Your young'uns does need schools, and when Clovis is a making you a good living, you ought to go to him if he wants it that way.